Definitely one of these working in progress.
Yeah, that's right. Going to the like.
It's very interesting. Okay.
I'm okay with it. Yeah.
Okay, great. And it'll mainly be home, or its home will be on the cloud, so I can also give anyone access if they want that. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is s.j.a, as you all know, and this is my presentation on my project entitled Exploring Dynamic Representations of Affect Through Perceptual Experience of Emotional Narratives, somewhat affectionately known, and for the sake of a catchy presentation title, as Stuck on a Feeling. I think I was also trying to like semi-quote a Journey lyric there, but so what I wanted to do in today's presentation and start off with is like an overview of what I'll be covering. So of course, I'll provide a project introduction or overview for those who are less familiar with the project. I will also talk a little bit about my previous aim, so sort of what I went into my generals exams proposing, and sort of the setup there. I'll also talk about the adjusted and current aims and what I'm hoping to accomplish within this year of the project. I'll talk, or from that discussion of the current aims, I'll give an overview of my current progress on accomplishing those aims and also a timeline for what that work could look like for the rest of the year. And then I'll provide brief discussion space on future trajectory, as we all know, and the pivots that are to come. So as an introduction, and I'll try to zoom through this, but of course, if anyone has any questions or particular points of clarity that they need, please feel free to stop me and ask. But this entire project is really shaped around the central question: how does emotion shape our perceptual experiences? And there are very specific lenses through which I was sort of examining or looking at this question. First of all, we have this understanding within work and perception on cognition that we both have our internal states and sort of the subjective context that we operate within our mind space and within our internal space and how we understand the world. But then we also have this interfacing with our external world. This comes from in the form of both visual stimuli as well as other sensory input, social interactions, so on and so forth. We know that in terms of the intermediate or the mediation between these internal and external states, that salience and context really do drive what we experience, what we remember, and how we ruminate upon sort of this information that we receive. And across many fields, we sort of understand that even more so than just being a covariate of our experience, that emotion and sort of our subjective experience of emotion serves as a key conduit of a lot of this perceptual interaction. What we know about emotion, both intuitively and also in the literature, is that emotion is far less about what we feel in terms of static or sort of discrete states, and a lot more about how we feel in a very dynamic and multitudinous context. And of course, when we come into this understanding, or we try to sort of investigate this within a research context, we are faced with this question of how we characterize emotion without overgeneralizing or losing dimensionality. Many of us are familiar with the research or the literature that has explored questions around the 6 basic emotions, around emotion categories versus affective dimensions. And it really is a sort of question or conundrum that many researchers across different disciplines are faced with. And within the sort of subfield of naturalistic neuroscience and narrative neuroscience, we come to our interactions with this phrase, this term called naturalistic stimuli, right? And this encompasses everything from visual stimuli, so movies, films, even commercials, trailers, things like that, and also auditory inputs, so sound, spoken narratives. We know that a lot of this naturalistic stimuli, which we really use that term to describe things that sort of mirror or imitate the type of input that we would interact with in the real world, also give us very rich representations of perceptual states. And so in a lot of the current bodies of literature, we utilize naturalistic stimuli to try and get at these representations of memory, of social cognition, and of other perceptual states that mirror what we actually interact with in everyday life. So in bridging all 3 of these considerations together, we come to this question: can we use narratives to characterize how emotion drives our perceptual experiences? And more specifically, and sort of to frame that question around the considerations that were made for this project, we asked this question: how can we characterize the dynamics of affective experience during emotional narratives using naturalistic metrics of behavioral and neural response? So again, this is trying to capture the experience of subjective or subjective experience of motion and of these perceptual states in sort of as much of a multimodal context as they are originally experienced. And so to do this, the project was broken into three main aims. So our first aim was to construct a behavioral paradigm to quantify continuous emotional experience during narrative perception. And this would be done sort of in the context of the experiment by collecting behavioral ratings or behavioral data through ratings and deducing dimensions of affective sort of perception of our chosen stimuli. And I'll go into a little bit more about that design choice later. And essentially get these continuous annotations of emotion over the course of presentation to represent how emotion dynamically fluctuates or how affect dynamically fluctuates. I'll also say for the sake of this project, I use affect and emotion somewhat interchangeably. I used to have like a key term definition slide, but just take that to be that I'm using them synonymously, even though they have a little bit more of a distinction when you consider the finer details. In aim 2, we were looking to characterize persistence of affective content in perception and subsequent behavioral reflection. And this was specifically in the context of the neural component of our experience, or our experiment, so with our fMRI data. And this was going to be done through a 2-session fMRI study. And I'll go more into the design of that study as well, where we were going to be comparing pattern similarity between notable events, both in the reflection phase, or I'll reverse the order. So in the encoding phase, when the movie is initially viewed uninterrupted, and then also during subsequent reflection, when our participants get to talk about their experience, their emotional experience specifically with that film. And aim number 3, definitely one of the most ambitious aims, was going to be trying to map the affective content that was sort of extracted from both aim 1 and aim 2, and use that to map onto neural representations and sort of predict behavior and also predict brain patterns that were taking place during perception and reflection. This was going to involve computational modeling, both training a model, an encoding model, on these affective dimensions, and then trying to get it to sort of predict what the subsequent brain response would be, but then also trying to sort of reverse engineer that and predict the responses based on sort of the training set or the set of neural data that we had. So really see if we can extract from there what these affective dimensions were from that neural activity. And I'll go into all three of these a little bit later as well. So to get into the actual meat of the experiment itself and what we were using as our stimulus set. So this is where I get really excited to talk about it, specifically from the perspective of being a filmmaker, because this was a really intentional venture in me curating and selecting each of these films and each of these sort of visual narratives very, very intentionally. So for our 2-session study, session 1 was comprised of 10 short films, which had runtimes between 5 and 8 minutes. And these were selected across genres. We have romance, we have horror, we have comedy, we even have music video in there. My own film was included, which was, real privilege and pleasure. And many films that were created by filmmakers that I either have been in community with or familiar with, but all that have some level of critical acclaim. So these are filmmakers who have won Emmys, who have won BAFTAs. Their work is considered to be of this quality of like sort of visual storytelling. But another intention that I went into the selection of the stimulus with, or the stimuli, was that I wanted each of these films to present a world that was both narratively complex, but also emotionally ambiguous or emotionally sort of variable. So it wasn't as though the narrative was guiding any of the participants from one or towards one singular resolution or emotional point, but rather they were introduced to a visual world in which that they could explore and sort of come to their own conclusions about what they felt about it. And that was done both by selection of films across genre, across time, but also ones that sort of allowed for a lot of exploration. And for the stimulus for session 2, this was our longer form or longer duration visual narrative. The episode or a television episode of the hit show Euphoria was chosen. And specifically this episode, which was season 2, episode 5, was one that the visual narrative was presented and sort of provided to participants or provided to viewers in multiple different acts, where you saw interactions between characters of many heightened emotions. It was very intense across the episode, but intense in different ways. And you were able to come into that world without a lot of necessary context or familiarity with the show, but still definitely leave sort of with lingering feelings, lingering thoughts on the character interactions and also the implications for one's own emotional state and relational states. So to get into a little bit of what the fMRI task paradigm looked like, I wanted to break it down across both of the sessions. So in session 1, and this was actually switched sort of in the way that it was originally presented. So euphoria was used as the session 2 stimulus, and the short films were used as session 1, but I'll just explain it as it's presented right now. So when we showed the participants euphoria, it began with our phase 1, which was the encoding phase, where participants watched the entire episode uninterrupted. I will say that because of the runtime of the episode, which was approximately 56 minutes, it was broken into 3 concurrent fMRI runs. So they were presented with 20 minutes of the episode at a time. And after they watched that, the episode uninterrupted, they were then given a period of time, actually an unrestricted period of time, to do what we referred to as general reflection, which really just entailed free experiential recall. And this was the exact prompt that was presented to them that says, in your own words, describe how you felt about the events of this episode as if you were talking to a friend, describe to the best of your ability any significant events or emotions you experienced, and provide as much context as you can as to why you felt this way. Take as much time as you need. One of the really specific intentions around the framing of this question was, one, we wanted the recall or sort of the verbal reflection to be somewhat colloquial, right? We didn't want it to seem as though they were talking to a researcher and then they had to explain it in sort of the most technical terms or hit at specific linguistic nodes. We wanted it to sort of be in their own language and in their own way, their description of how they felt and not just what they felt. And then following the general reflection period, we had a quote unquote guided reflection period where we presented short clips from the episode that they had just watched. These each ranged from 30 seconds to a minute long. And then they had sort of shorter reflection questions or a shorter reflection period that they were able to talk more specifically about the details of that particular scene. And then we also provided them with the opportunity to provide ratings across these different prompts. And it was sort of a Likert scale, so on a scale of 1 to 7 for each of these questions. And the ratings had to do with comprehension of the scene, or the rating of the intensity, the rating of their comprehension, I think I said that before, and also the degree of immersion that they sort of felt after watching that. So we had both the verbal reflection and then also these experiential ratings for each of these scenes.
How long does every take?
On average for the entire one session was it's about 2 hours long. Mm-hmm. And we do provide them with a brief break between the general reflection and this guided reflection, but they tend to zoom through it. And then for session 2, as it's titled here, which was actually our session 1, it was a very similar design where we provided, or each of the short films was presented to the participants and they got to watch it uninterrupted during the encoding phase. And then following the uninterrupted viewing, they then performed another version of this general reflection where they talked about sort of their experience watching it, and then also provided ratings for each of those short films. So we have ratings for each of the short films, as well as ratings for the guided sort of scenes in the Euphoria session.
So in that session 2, it's labeled as session 2 here.
Yes.
They didn't have the part where you give them little bits of it and then they just rate the whole thing.
Yes, they rate the whole thing because each of these shorts is about 5 to 8 minutes long. And so rather than provide them scenes, we just have them rate the whole thing. So going back to what I discussed in our sort of the previous aims or the aims that we based our initial design on, we had this approach with aim 1 to collect these time course annotations of affective experience from a rich descriptive label space during presentation of a self-contained visual narrative. And one thing that I'll say about this first aim that I actually don't think I explicitly outline in this presentation, aim 1 was tied to a behavioral component of the experiment that happened outside the scanner. So this is where participants would have been viewing each of the short films, right? So the 5 to 8 minute long stimuli, and then they would be rating the sort of giving emotional ratings using this emotional label space like sort of across a sliding window of ratings. This was not an experiment or part of the experiment that was eventually executed. We actually do have the sort of online component and the behavioral component of it set up, but we didn't end up collecting data for this. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was sliding through each of the, I keep wanting to say episodes, but it was sliding through each of the films, and they would provide ratings from this 27 label space. And we were going to use that later. But I still wanted to present AIM-1 just to talk about sort of.
Different subject.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
like tags,
Exactly.
tagging
Yeah.
moments.
Tagging moments. And that's what we were going to then use to sort of set up the affective dimension space to be fed into the model. Yeah. And so how this was going to be done in detailing the sub-aims was going to be collecting these continuous dynamic labels for emotional experience across the presentation. We're then going to vectorize these labels using or sort of extract the word embeddings for each of the labels using an NLP model, and then projecting those into an affective dimension space that would then use or be used to compare against the brain data. Moving on to AIM-2, though, that this is the one that we were sort of able to execute using the brain or the neural data that we collected. We were asking this question of, do event representations for salient emotional events persist in recall behavior? And so here, this was specifically based on sort of a previous study from the lab, Chen et al. 2017, in which we were looking at the difference between encoding and recall and seeing if behavior or sort of the neural activity patterns during recall sort of mirrored what was going on when they were presented with that same scene during encoding. And so we were going to be using the recall behavior, so this experiential reflection, when they were talking about given scenes, especially if they came up in their general reflection, right? We don't guide them towards speaking about specific scenes. So if that came up, what does that tell us about, what was going on in their brains during encoding phase? And so the way that this was going to be executed was by collecting the fMRI data in the way that I just detailed, and then extracting these neural representations from reflection events and using that as a search template. So going back and saying, if this was something that they talked about and they made note of having a significant impact on them while they were reflecting, can we actually see any signatures of that significant impact during their sort of encoding phase activation? And then we were going to also look at the individual differences between the perceptual events. So if a given person talks about a scene in a certain level of detail with a certain level of complexity or intensity, is there some significant signature of activation either in the duration of their neural activation pattern or in the amplitude, right? This was like a theoretical space that points out or sort of highlights that significance. And then in AIM-3, where we were asking this question about the affective features and how they're represented in the brain, this is where we were going to do this mapping of the affective content onto the neural representations. And that would be accomplished in twofold, both through an encoding analysis where we are examining, estimating the voxel-wise encoding models and using those affect embeddings that would have come from AIM-1 and using that to predict sort of neural activation or brain behavior. And then also doing a little bit of like a reverse encoding analysis where we then use that fitted model to predict the labels, right? And try to see if we can actually get predictions of the affective dimensions at individual time points. And then came the pivot. And so there's a lot that I could say in this phase, but I think in both the design and construction of this experiment, I think I first was theorizing about this towards the end of my first year, and then went through phases of implementation of trying to sort of fine-tune the design. And then, of course, coming to the point where I realized that some of my, academic goals are changing and so on and so forth. And so we've pivoted, right, and tried to sort of both consolidate the design of the experiment, but then also see what would be most logical to execute. So this is sort of a laying out of what the current aims are, and I'll go from both current aims into talking about what we've accomplished thus far. So the first aim being this identification of both shared and idiosyncratic patterns of narrative-driven activation. So still very similar to the literature that I pointed out in Chen 2017, and looking at what is going on during encoding, right? And where do we see sort of the strongest signals of shared patterns of activity through ISC and then also through through other analyses and comparing that to sort of the subsequent recall behaviors and also the different metrics that we collected. We have ratings, we also have physio data. I don't actually think I explicitly outlined that earlier, but we collected respiratory data as well as at some points heart rate, like our, the actual tools of measurement sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, but using sort of all of these different forms of data to try and understand a little bit more about where these patterns are shared and also where idiosyncrasy appears. And then the second aim would really be preparing this data for tentative open source sharing. So again, saying this is a very rich data set, a lot has been collected. There are a lot of questions that could be answered both in the thread of this experimental design, but also in future interest in subjective perspective, in intake of audiovisual stimuli, so on and so forth. And so what would it look like to prepare these data for tentative open source sharing? And so the sub aims of this, which sort of reflect what I've talked about already, would be continuing to collect the fMRI data that we both have from encoding and recall phase, where we currently are at with performing these both time varied and then also spatial ISC analyses to identify these patterns of shared cognition, both over the course of time of the stimulus presentation, but then also in specific regions of interest. Perform transcription of the recall data, which is no small feat at all whatsoever, to really say if there were interest in trying to run NLP models and other semantic and sentiment analyses on the reflections later, how could we set that up? And then also, most importantly, establishing very clear pre-processing pipelines, as well as pipelines for data anonymization. There's a lot of trust that our participants are putting in us with the amount that they talk to us and tell us about in this experiment, and then also the analyses pipelines for subsequent sharing. So to go into sort of the both progress with this and then also the timeline, with regards to data collection, currently we have 5 full subjects worth of data, and this includes the neural data, so 2 full sessions worth, as well as their verbal reflection data, both from general reflection, guided reflection, and then reflection on each of the short films. We have the physiometrics, as I measured before, and also for each of these shorts, and then the guided reflection phases, these stimulus ratings. And then the goal, sort of by the end of this semester, would be to have 20 subjects to really get both to the level of power that would be needed for subsequent individual difference analyses, but then also just to sort of round out the findings that we have. And I'll actually be showing you some of those preliminary results in a little bit. With pre-processing, we've currently, and this is something that I was advised to emphasize, sort of the amount of work that's gone into building this pipeline, right? So we've built a pipeline to not only go from taking our raw data, like straight from the scanner, and moving it through both all sorts of levels of pre-processing and data smoothing, or sorry, spatial smoothing, motion correction, and then also just quality control and quality analysis, but then also specifically trying to do a simultaneous sort of implementation of an fMRI prep pipeline, and then also NiLearn and Nifty Masker for confound regression and sort of correction of all sorts of other anomalies that come up when you're collecting fMRI data. So this has been no small feat, and we have to do this subject by subject and session by session to sort of fine tune this pipeline and try to get it to a sort of standardized, normalized state. And so the overall or sort of end goal for this would be to continue refining the pipeline and have the data pre-processed for subsequent sharing. So sort of make sure that what we are able to share and present has gone through sort of the steps. And this is all sort of in accordance with not only the reproducible neuroimaging practices that are really championed at PNI, and I really have to give a huge shout out to Sam Nastasi for the amount of work and sort of collaboration that we've done on this, but also just sort of trying to follow both BIDS formatting on a sort of more external level, and saying that if this is going to be shared outside of just our lab space, what would it look like to provide people with something that is as standardized as possible. And then lastly, with analyses, so currently we have scripts for both the time varied and spatial ISC that are, well, time varied that we actually have shared already to the GitHub repository for the project. And this is linked in the presentation, and I could take you there and actually show you that. I have a little screenshot of it in a later slide. So we have both of the sort of analyses for those ongoing, and then the goal would be to continue refining the ISC scripts and really to run statistical, very hard word to say very fast, run statistical comparisons with all of our, other forms of data, right? So we have these behavioral ratings, we have the different physiometrics, and we have these comparisons between what the reflection and the transcriptions will sort of output, and then also, like between and within subject consideration. So there's a lot that can even be done with what we have already. And the goal would be to sort of set up a pipeline for that. And then also, fingers crossed, perform transcription of the recall data, so that can also be shared.
So, so you say collect two subjects per week. How realistic is it? So did you manage to collect data this week?
So data wasn't collected this week, just because of preparing for this. And also, one thing that I will say with the data collection process, we had very specific, especially at the outset of this experiment, we had really specific inclusion and exclusion criteria, right? So especially using a show like Euphoria, we were trying to find participants who hadn't had any exposure to that show. There were periods of time where, data was trying to be collected over the summer when participant population was reduced. And also, participants have to have both some familiarity with fMRI scanning, but then also be comfortable with sitting in the scanner for 2 hours uninterrupted. And so it's been both a matter of trying to adjust our expectations with inclusion and exclusion, and then also finding participants that are actually viable. Right now, I think we have at least 2 to 3 tentative participants that could be scheduled for next week and weeks following. But it is a matter of sort of sorting that out as it comes. So I think it is reasonable to try and get up to 20 subjects by the end of the semester. I think that could be very achievable, especially as a lot of the sort of mechanisms of recruitment and sort of like taking in subjects has now been figured out over the course of the last sort of period of time. But I want to be realistic with the goal.
Should we relax the requirement of not seeing Euphoria before to get to 20?
How restrictive is that proved to be?
It's proved quite restrictive. So over the summer, of the 5 subjects we collected, 2 of those were collected over the summer. And with the interest that we had, there was like at least 2 to 3 subjects that we just couldn't take in because they had watched it before. That's specifically being sort of due to the context familiarity consideration. So if a participant is watching the episode with no context and no experience with the show at all whatsoever, versus someone who's watched the entire show, is familiar with the characters, that could have effects. But
it's not a memory study, it's an emotional study. It can go both ways. It can amplify your emotion because you are more connected to the character, or can habituate your responses because you don't care. But in any case, it will evoke some emotion that we're going to talk about.
But for like ISA analyses, if you see before you can predict it, and that gets you out of sync. Yeah, it could. I guess it's a good point. I mean, I just don't know whether that's actually the rate determining factor.
Right.
That's what I was trying to. Like, surely some people have seen Euphoria, but like, is that? It's not clear from this conversation so far, like how much that
affects. Right. And
over the summer, it's just there weren't people around for anything.
Right. And one thing that I'll say too is like and I know we've sort of talked about this, but now we have the plan to recruit for session 1 and session 2 separately. So like someone can qualify for the study even if they've watched Euphoria. We would just do like sort of have them in part in the first session. But it's also a matter of like in the most fine-grained way, which participants are being recruited for like class credit, which participants are being paid, so on and so forth. And who is it that like actually will be able to withstand some of the films that are included with the study. We had to do a lot of sort of prepping and making sure we inform participants of the nature of the content beforehand. We give them like the necessary trigger warnings. So some people opt out.
I'm a little worried about time. So can I ask another question? The statistical comparisons to behavior ratings, like what's some examples? Yeah,
so one of the things that I've been really interested in looking at, especially when I show you the plots later of like the sort of ISC for each of the short films, is if we see particular consistencies and like shared patterns, what does it look like when we look at the ratings of like intensity and we look at the ratings of like other factors that the participants provided after after watching each of those films. So if something scored very high on the intensity scale, for instance, would we see that reflected in the overall sort of like activation pattern for that given film when we are collapsing across subjects? So that's another sort of addition to the between participants analysis that I'm interested in looking at. And then also, I don't think, again, it's sort of going to make it into our current plan, but there is a lot to say about what was happening physiologically, and sort of the looking at the respiration, looking at the heart rate over the course of the or over the course of stimulus watching. I'll just also say from like being in the scanner and collecting these data in real time, a lot of participants talk about the viscerality of a lot of these films, right? And so I'm interested in seeing basically if that viscerality comes through in some form of scoring.
I think I've made this point before, like, for all these things, it's worth, if you want to do it, really unpacking exactly which numbers you're comparing to which numbers. Because I think the sort of devil is in the details of like, if you wanted to relate intensity to ISC, how exactly would you do that?
Right, and there
a lot of these things are more complicated than
that's very true. And there is precedent for that. So like in sort of the two core references. So there's both the Emily Finn paper that she looked at idiosyncrasy or sort of idiosyncratic behavior and was looking at it in comparison to personality scales. We do also have for each of these participants ratings on both the PHQ or PHQ-9, GAD, and the ABI. So we have ratings of their like sort of depression scale, their anxiety, and then also their predisposition to these emotional states. That could also be really comparison or interesting to look at in comparison if we have time and sort of capacity to look more into the individual differences. So
like transcription of recall data, do you mean like typing out what they said? Is there a reason not to use a service for that?
That's a good question.
I don't know if that's not kosher.
Which service are you using?
I forgot what it's called, but it's super cheap.
I use REC.
I think that's exactly
REC.
It is good. I still would recommend having it on.
But are they right? So there are two steps to it. One of them is getting the sounds into words.
Yes.
And then the other one is locking the words to time points, which is needed for some of these things. Well, that's just, you know, they're anyway.
They will REC will timestamp them. It's not
super
Well,
helpful.
There's
right.
REV.
Oh, REV, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, it's REV.
Okay, the point being, no one should be typing the transcript. Like,
Yeah.
s.j.a should not be.
It was a fear for a while. It was.
Okay, so anyway.
Yeah, it is. It's complicated because, of course, this is sort of audio data that's coming from a scanner. You have a lot of surround sound and like noise.
We use the service for the we had people telling us stories.
Okay, so it's for the narratives. Okay, that's something people have mentioned whisper, but I don't actually know.
That's
I don't think it will do.
No, okay. REV, I'm going to look into. Okay.
Let's roll onward.
Yep. So looking a little bit at what the preliminary results are, and I break this up between the sort of this plot for Euphoria, where we collapsed across each run of the episode. So this is across the episode and across the 3 initial subjects that we collected. And then in the next slide, I'll show you a little bit more of the shorts, which is really exciting to me. This is a little snapshot of what the actual notebook and what the code for doing this looks like. So this was all done using Brainiac and using sort of the nifty masker and sort of glass brain plotting to sort of generate these ISCs. But what the initial interpretation of these findings are, and of course, there's still a lot of like actual cleaning and statistical comparisons to run. I hope to do this and sort of have more data to stack on top of it. But we're seeing a very strong between participant similarity across regions that are consistent with sort of audiovisual presentation. So we're going to have spatial ISC that follows and get a little bit more of a specific understanding of where we see the strong signal. But even at this point, we're seeing things that are consistent with previous literature of like the ISC when people are watching visual narratives. And then, even more interestingly, and I think one of the reasons that this slide is exciting to me is because I'm very much into the sort of looking at emotional connectome and so on and so forth, and saying, what are the differences when you're looking at different things? But here we are looking at the mean ISC, so inter-subject correlation plots across subject for each of these short films that were presented. So each of these 10 plots is for each of the films, and this is explicitly during the encoding phase. So this is when they're watching the entire thing through. This is our session 1 data. This is from 3 subjects, and this is also all thresholded at 0.8. So the sort of color map that you're seeing is also consistent. And sort of the initial interpretation here is that we see really strong nodes of like strong ISC in given regions between different stimuli, but we also see that there are areas or different, examples where the ISC is not as strong. One of the things that I personally still find a lot of optimism in seeing non-strong ISC is if that is cause for, or if that is like leading into strong idiosyncratic response. So what would it look like in a sort of individual or subject to subject level to look at the sort of pattern of activation for that given film. But this is sort of where that comparison with behavioral ratings and also the reflection data would help us identify what significant differences are versus what is just weak signal overall. So thinking a little bit about next steps. So of course, thinking about practical ways to proceed, we first come to this point of what it looks like to format the data and also the sort of analyses pipelines for open source sharing. And this would be very similar to what was done with the narratives data sets in s.j.a 2021. It's really important here, kind of going along with what you were saying, Ken, to focus on what metrics are extractable. This was in every sense and way, shape, and form a very ambitious project. And there's a lot that can be taken from it, a lot that can be construed. And so it's this question of how can these data still be utilized and what question could still be asked. And it's also very important, again, in really existing with this project from inception to the point that it's at now, to take note of what the limitations and the complications of this type of experimental setup. There is a reason that both research and sort of work on subjective experience, on individual differences, and on emotion are very complex questions. And I sort of faced that over the course of not only experimental design, but then also trying to sort of move through these analyses. And thinking of potential future directions. And these are the directions that I was thinking about even before the sort of pivot or change in direction with where the experiment was at right now. I think it would be very, very interesting to examine other stimulus features. So thinking of the difference between long and short duration stimuli, a lot of experiments either go from sort of 5-second clips where they're having people rate emotions or, hour-long movies, right? It's either a GIF of a cute cat or it's Forrest Gump. And so what does it actually look like to evaluate the way that emotion plays out over the course of time? An initial iteration of this experiment, we were trying to look a lot into temporal integration. So like, how does the course of an emotional experience sort of play out when you're watching something that is long form versus short form? I also have a lot of interests and sort of a lot of questions about this space of stimulus novelty versus familiarity. And that gets at the question of how much does context familiarity affect people's watching experience. I will say that, again, just from the side of being both filmmaker and then also really into episodic cinema, there is a lot to say about the amount of emotion that people lump on when they are familiar with the show, when they've watched it again, and this sort of second watch effect that comes up. And I think Euphoria is a really great example of that, because many people watch it once and then decide that they can never watch it again. So what does it mean to actually return to that narrative space? And then also the last question is this one of subject perceptibility. I don't necessarily know if I like that phrasing particularly, but thinking of the trait versus state specific watching preference and behavior. So what is it that people opt into watching when they're given choice of genre, when they are given choice of media, and why is that? Is it because it sort of introduces them to an emotional state that they find comfort or familiarity in, or is it because it takes them out of an emotional state that they would like to sort of escape from? And so again, thinking about, and what I have here on the side is just the sort of example from s.j.a 2021 of the metrics that were collected. So of course, the functional brain data was provided, and they gave information on like the technology type and the factors that were considered. And so really setting up all the different components of this experiment to be shareable and sort of to be utilizable later on. And now just to give like a very brief moment of talking about my future trajectory and the things that I'm interested in. I think I came into this space actually having done previous work in attention memory space, having done previous work in decision-making space, and always returned to this question of the difference between internal and external states, and also subjective experience and perspective. And I've only come more into this understanding and this interest in perceived reality, but then also really the relationship between artist intention or sort of creative intention. So when a world is built, how much does the artist or the filmmaker predict of what they're going to offer to the world, but then also how does that resonate and sort of translate to a viewer's experience or a consumer's experience? And so the sort of things that I'm considering and really trying to explore, both in experimental sort of trajectories and then also in my personal creative practice, are these questions surrounding philosophy of mind, surrounding metacognition and metacreativity. So metacognition, of course, thinking about thinking, but then also creative ways of creating. I think there's a lot to be said about the synchrony that takes place between artists when they're creating or improvising together. And then also this larger question of experimental aesthetics and really understanding when we think of art and media and narratives as more than just a stimulus or sort of a node of extraction or a node of consumption, what do we understand more about the specificities of like how an aesthetic experience is built and also sort of explored either by someone who considers themselves an artist, and so sort of it's the expert or native population, or someone who is unfamiliar with art and has sort of a desire to consume and appreciate. And with all of that said, I'm really grateful to both everyone in the room. I'm grateful to Uri and Ken and sort of the entirety of Hassan Lab and Norman Lab for the amount that they sort of contributed to shape this project over time. I'm extremely grateful to Sam, who has really walked with me every step of the way and formulating and formatting this. And then also many of the postdocs, both within the PNI and Princeton Psych space, as well as outside of that have contributed in some way, shape, or form. I would not have, even though it didn't get implemented sort of in this iteration of the project, I would not have been able to build the online platform, which required me learning JavaScript very quickly without the help of Robert Hawkins, without the help of Sebastian. And I would really genuinely like to thank each of the filmmakers, again, some of whom are not only peers and colleagues of mine, but dear friends, for letting me use their films and use their media in this experiment, because I think they're very interested in where these questions could go as well. Yeah.
Thanks for the great presentation. I think maybe now is the time to cut the recording.
Yeah.
But that was yeah, really clear. Terrific overview.
And then I come back. Yep.
So,